The first time he said it, my flatmate turned landlord, leaning back like he owned the cushions and the air itself. My house, my rules. It landed on me like cold water. I remember laughing at the time because I wanted to believe it was a joke or a passing arrogance that would soften. I wanted to believe in the friend I thought I'd made in first year at university. I wanted to believe that the late-night instant noodle confessions and the shared panic before exams meant something more than convenience. We met in 2001, two ridiculous tired first years who learned to operate industrial washing machines and survive on cheap pizza. Back in those days, Donald's humor was the thing that turned boring Tuesday nights into something bearable. We were inseparable enough that when he announced in that cocky way that he'd bought a place and had a spare room, it felt natural to say yes. Rent was tight. He'd been a mate for 3 years. I thought it would be easy, normal. Another chapter of friendship. The place had low ceilings in the hallway, a kitchen with aged tiles that always seemed to hide old crumbs, a battered sofa that slumped in the middle like it was tired too. At first it was fine. Late-night TV binges, the kind of shallow domesticity you only get when you're 18 and think chores are a minor inconvenience. The house smelled like coffee and cheap detergent. The months drifted, and the little cracks began to show. It started with a barbed joke here, a passive-aggressive comment there. He'd make guest visitors feel like they'd intruded, a nudge and a smirk followed by relax. It's a joke. When I told him it wasn't funny, he'd grin, move on. He no longer came out on nights with us much. He'd sit at home, arms folded, and his aunt, an overbearing woman who loved to pop in for a cup of tea, started appearing at all hours, as if she held an invisible key. I worked part-time in retail, lifeguarding hours of fluorescent lights and polite apologies, while studying full-time. Money was a tightrope I walked every week, so when he announced one evening that he was getting Sky TV and expected me to pay half, I felt that sharp, familiar squeeze in my chest. "You'll pay half," he said, as if the boxes on the screen were already mine. "I can't afford it," I told him, explaining the 3 shifts, the textbooks, the mortgage of student debt I'd already signed my name to. He tilted his head, that smug ease forming around him like armor. "Then you don't get a say in what I watch on my TV." It was almost funny if you stripped out the control, but my house, my rules, didn't stay a throwaway line. It ossified into the only rule. It became his mantra, a blunt tool he used to silence me. Dishes left scattered, somehow my fault. The bins not taken out, clearly my negligence. A towel on the radiator. He'd freeze the air with his voice and state that I didn't respect his home. When I tried to remind him that I was juggling uni and a part-time job, he'd snap, "I work full-time. You're just a student." It didn't matter that I logged retail hours on weekends or stayed until closing during holidays. He counted my days at lectures and decided it meant I had nothing else to do but tidy up his life. It shrank me. The house, which had once been a place of noisy camaraderie, started to feel like a courtroom where I was always on trial. I stopped inviting people over because nobody wanted to be sneered at, subtly humiliated. I stopped staying in the common spaces because his presence turned every casual interaction into power play. I disappeared into my room more and more, learning the quiet economy of survival. Keep your head down, do your share, accept the slights. And while I retreated, I planned. A friend mentioned another flatmate opportunity. Someone needed a roommate. The room was solid, bright, a tiny balcony with a sliver of sky visible between buildings, and rent within reach. When I walked through it, I felt something that felt like oxygen. I signed on the relief was an odd, trembling thing. I could leave. I could choose not to engage in the emotional tax he levied on everyone who lived there. My parents were worried. They'd seen me thin and weary, picking at meals, flinching at text from home. When I told them I'd found somewhere else, it was a weight off their shoulders. They drove up the weekend I booked, an unspoken rescue mission. I didn't tell Donald. He had suggested I leave often enough that it felt almost pointless to inform him. He wanted me out. Perhaps he would be surprised. Perhaps not. Either way, I wasn't going to waste the drama. That Saturday was thin and bright. My mum carried boxes like a soldier on shore leave. My dad tucked a toolbox into the back of the car. I watched Donald through the frosted glass, like a scene from a play I had written but never expected to star in. He came down the stairs and froze. He was suddenly polished, slick hair, an easy smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I didn't know you were coming," he said, addressing my mother, as if a friendly surprise could rewrite months of condescension. I told him the truth plain and slow. "They're not visiting. They're here to move me out. I found a new flat." For a moment, just a tiny sliver, his expression flooded, his smirk fell away, confusion replacing it. He went pale. He looked like a man who'd lost an argument he'd always suspected he might win. He retreated to his room, doors closed like a play's final set falling. I left my keys on the coffee table. I did not say goodbye. I carried 3 boxes in my battered suitcase to the car, and that felt like carrying a sentence I had written for myself. The sentence was freedom. When the dust settled and I sat on the edge of my new mattress the size of someone's modest victory, my phone Donald. I'm really sorry for the way I behaved. I hope we can still be friends. I typed back, with a grin I could feel in my chest. Ha ha ha. I told myself that once you draw a line, the rest is tidy. But life, stubbornly likes to tie loose ends. The first few weeks in the new flat felt like breathing after a long time underwater. My roommate Ben, if we're naming people, turned out to be quiet and decent. The kind who washed up his own dishes and didn't make condescending jokes at 2 a.m. He was into music with the kind of subtle passion that made him disappear into a song for hours. We became friends in that slow, warm way that forms when you're not on guard. My life simplified. Work shifts fit neatly around classes. Evenings were for cooking things that weren't microwavable. For a time I luxuriated in the domestic simplicity of the previous house became a memory that felt both distant and sharp, like an old scar you forget until you bump it. I didn't expect to hear anything about Donald after that. People drift in and out of your life. You assume things resolve, or fester, or vanish, and you live. So when mutual friends started whispering that he was struggling with mortgage payments, I tilted my head. Did I have a guilty conscience? Maybe. Did I keep living? Absolutely. I had no intention of undoing the life I'd just started patching together. But the news kept coming. People wouldn't move in with him. Word got around. He'd been arrogant, turning friends away, enforcing rules like they were sacred law until he had no one left. Mortgages are pragmatic beasts. They eat reputation and time. A small private pleasure came in the form of information. No one wanted to sign a check for him now. You don't realize how powerful your absence can be until it causes a collapse you're not there to catch. I caught myself smiling about the irony, then felt an internal nudge that maybe I was being petty. I kept my distance. Ben and I would go to markets, pick up fresh bread, watch old movies awkwardly together, stealing blankets. I would wake at dawn and write notes for a lecture or sketch plans for a presentation. My life warmed in a modest, steady way. Then, someone mentioned in passing that he'd moved back in with his mum. My chest pricked at the image. Donald, forced back into someone else's rules. The irony had no celebration in me, just a quiet sense of consequence. Weeks turned to months. The seasons changed from a lazy summer to a drizzle-laced autumn, and then the holidays came, the ones where families gathered and you pretended at table topics to be content. It was in one of those thin, rain-streaked evenings that something else happened, an unlikely string of messages, whispers of stories about how he'd handled people, how he'd shoved friends away with that my house line until there was no tribe left. I didn't spread these stories. I didn't need to. But once you've been on the wrong end of someone's game, you develop a nose for patterns. You notice how people respond, who leaves, who stays. You see the moment their power becomes a liability. People who tolerate petty tyranny do it because it's easier than confrontation. Once the man behind the curtain loses the collective patience of his people, he collapses. I found comfort in the mundane. Grocery shops, lectures, laundry, and there was also a subtle continuing realization that what I had lost, what I had left, wasn't only a house, but an entire part of myself that had learned to accept humiliation. That learning to leave had been the stretch of character work no one teaches you in school. It was messy, it was oddly glorious. Occasionally when drunken friends retold the story at parties, someone would ask, "Did you ever regret it?" I'd always answer with a firm no. Regret is a heavy thing and I didn't want to pick it up. I had traded the comfort of being known by someone who had never respected me, for the lightness of being respected by people I hadn't yet met. The trade felt fair, and yet, life has a way of surfacing small revenge stories like shells on a shore. You walk past them, and tuck them into your pocket to admire later. Mine came in the form of an offhand confession at a mutual friend's birthday. "You won't believe what happened to Donald," someone said. "He had to move back to his mum's." And then a name dropped, the mortgage provider. Turns out, when you're charismatic on the surface, and controlling in private, lenders see the surface, friends see the private. When both sides withdraw, the structure collapses. I felt a strange distance from the whole thing, like watching a storm from a secure port. I wasn't joyous, but I wasn't sorry either. Only the knowledge that the lack of him in my life had allowed space for things to breathe felt like victory. Sometimes closure isn't dramatic. It isn't a courtroom. It's the quiet recognition that you did the right thing for yourself. It's ironing a shirt, without his face in the reflection, cooking a meal without bracing for criticism. It's small and domestic and perfect. But the story didn't end there. For me, the satisfying part, the thing that writers and readers both like to see, was the moment he was blindsided. It wasn't legal revenge, it wasn't expose a scoundrel on a town square, it was simpler and more humane. The shock in his eyes when he realized that the person he'd been bulldozing for years had finally listened to him and left. I didn't plan some grand spectacle. My exit had been practical. My parents had been mercifully efficient, but the memory of the way he folded in on himself, the brief, sudden vulnerability that showed when the mask cracked, is a thing that lingered. People often romanticize revenge. They think it must be theatrical, loud, a public sport, but true revenge, if you want to call it that, often feels mundane. It's the act of prioritizing yourself. It's moving your life forward in spite of a force that tried to stop you. The heart of my satisfaction wasn't that he failed without me, but that I had chosen my life over the tyranny of performance. There were times later, when we had a few mutual acquaintances, his name would circle back into conversation. People would roll their eyes, laugh, talk about how he'd thought himself indispensable. I'd sometimes mention in passing, the moment I left, how I dropped the keys and walked out. They'd laugh, a shared amusement for people who'd watched a bully corner himself. But what I hadn't counted on, and what made the final unraveling feel poetic, was how his own behavior had closed doors he never expected to slam shut. He had a way of making people feel small, often disguised as joke, but the accumulation of insult, the slow drip of condescension, had an erosive effect on friendships. People began to leave, and that is how the world settles its accounts. Not with gavel and judge, but with exodus. I moved on. Ben and I grew close. We saw new places, mapped secondhand bookstores, argued over the right way to stew tomatoes. Life's pleasures were quieter. The hot slice of bread out of the oven, the way a campus lecture finally clicked, the satisfaction of paying rent on time. None of it was dramatic, but it all felt true. One evening, over a curry we made from scratch and drank cheap red wine from a supermarket, Ben said, "You ever think about that guy much?" Sometimes, I admitted, stirring the rice. Sometimes I feel guilty about the joy I take in him finally getting what he deserved. He laughed, kind and uncomplicated. You don't have to hold guilt for someone else's bad behavior. It was an easy human exchange. No triumphalism, just recognition. An unexpected part of moving on was how much energy it freed. People think relationships cost time. They do, but they also cost emotional currency. The worry, the strategizing, the fear of saying the wrong thing. Living with him had cost me evenings of ease. Leaving him gave me those evenings back. I started saying yes to things I'd have declined before. Open mic nights where I recited half a sketch I'd written. Breakfast with a friend I hadn't seen in months. A spontaneous train to the coast in winter. It's strange how a small decisive moment can reframe you. The walk from his house that morning. Coffee cups, boxes, a final glance felt like a hinge that swung. On the other side there was air. It was not vindictive air. It was just a different atmosphere, one where my choices were my own, not props in someone else's drama. People asked later, did you ever confront him? And the answer was no. Confrontation sometimes feels like prolonging the scene. I preferred to close the curtain and let the audience leave. His absence spoke for itself. 2 decades later, the story has a soft, satisfying texture to it. I picture him occasionally like an odd bruise in the memory, and the rest of life around it feels luminous. There's a part of this I should own. The small human delight in watching someone who thought themselves indispensable stumble. It feels humane when their choices return to them like a boomerang. It's not cruelty. It's the universe recalibrating, nothing mystical. People sow the winds. They reap the storms. After that, my life expanded in ways I didn't expect. I took risks. Some worthy, some I learned to trust the kindness of strangers, and to appreciate the steady warmth of friends who didn't measure me. I learned that sometimes the biggest victories are private. Paying your rent on time, knowing the perfect angle to cut an onion, answering a text from your mother without your chest clenching. Ben and I stayed in touch long past the time when roommates usually fade. He became family by choice, the one who celebrated the small wins and endured the setbacks. We traveled to coastal towns and rented tiny rooms above cafes, learned the names of stray cats, met people who introduced us to music we'd never heard before. As for Donald, he passed out of my daily life, the way fog lifts off a field. Occasionally a mutual friend would offer an update like a weather report. He's moved back with his mum. He's working odd jobs. He tried to call but no one picked up. Each line landed like a punctuation mark on the one chapter of my life he had occupied. Impossibly small now. If there's a moral to this, it's not that bullies crumble. They don't always. Sometimes they thrive. The moral is simpler and sharper. Your life is not a resource for someone else to harvest. When you stop offering yourself up, when you close the door and move, you reclaim a precious thing. You reclaim your days. There's a humility to the recovery too. You learn how you could have spoken up sooner. You learn as much about yourself as you do about them. I started offering my friends advice, not in a preachy way, but with quiet confidence. I told them to notice the patterns, to watch for the sentence that ends with maybe you should move out. If someone speaks in terms that make you small, they want you small. You get to choose otherwise. And for the record, I never told the whole truth to friends when they asked for details. Some things are sharper in your mind when they're half told. People fill in the edges with their own sense of justice. That's their revenge too. In the years since I finished university, upgraded jobs, paid off more than I thought I would. I had relationships that failed, and some that taught me about care and reciprocity. I had long nights alone, with a cat who slept on my chest like a small disgruntled heater. I had mornings where I finally felt like the author of my own schedule. Every so often I catch myself in a shop window, looking at my reflection, and thinking, that was a long time ago. I remember the tightness in my chest, the exhausted gratitude of being let out of a situation I hadn't realized was a trap. I remember the way my parents moved like a team to get me packed, their expressions a mixture of fury and relief. And when, years later, someone mentions Donald's name in a conversation, and everyone tenses a little, I simply smile and say we all learned something. No triumphalism, no gloating, just an observation. People who were once storms in your life sometimes become weather report. You learn to carry a jacket. Part 5. The final thing I'll say about all of this is that it taught me a practical everyday courage, the courage to leave small tyranny. They are easier to shrug off because they don't look like tyrannies at first. They look like jokes or preferences or normal boundaries, but preferences can calcify into control if you let them. The real challenge was understanding that leaving isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's a matter of logistics, finding a room, booking a van, calling your parents. When I look back, I realize the bravest part wasn't locking the door behind me. It was deciding not to spend another year shrinking into someone's passive-aggressive shadow. It was choosing the discomfort of growth over the hollow comfort of being tolerated. By now, Ben and I are scattered across different neighborhoods, different cities even. Our lives have branched, but sometimes those branches we text jokes in the small hours. We send each other photos of ridiculous pastries. Friends come and go, but people who show up when you move houses, those are the ones you remember. As for titles, landlord, flatmate, friend, they are thin labels shaped by context. People will surprise you. The same man who once made a household feel like a prison might one day be a lesson. It's sobering to accept that not everyone takes that lesson. Some repeat the pattern with new victims. But the difference is now obvious. When you do the work to remove yourself from their orbit, their pattern will either kill itself or continue somewhere else. Your life continues, and often it blooms in ways you hadn't imagined because you finally had the space to grow. If anyone reading this is still living with a thinly veiled tyrant, let me say this plainly. You don't owe them your dreams. You don't owe them the rent of your dignity. Take the practical steps you need. Find a room, call a friend, save for a van, and go. The rest will fall into place. It's not always easy. It's often messy. But leaving is a skill. Practice it. There's no cinematic courtroom scene where he confesses and cries on cue. There's no movie montage where his empire crumbles to dust in one glorious day. In truth, the satisfaction was a simple thing. I moved without telling him. I left my keys on the coffee table, and I walked out. That's the whole climax. That's the quiet revenge. 2 decades on, I still sometimes think about the man who called my home his own, and wanted to rule. I feel nothing but a calm gratitude that I left. Gratitude for parents who helped, for friends who made space, for the small ordinary acts of courage that assemble a life. So if you remember one line from this story, let it be this: your life is not a resource. Take it back, then make something with it.